Hi, in this video, we're going to look at an extension of the Chapter 5 example. So in Chapter 5, we were interested in building perceptual and preference maps to better understand brand positioning. So for our specific example, we had a set of retailers and a set of attributes, and we asked consumers to rate those retailers on those attributes. And we started by drawing a perceptual map, where the perceptual map showed us people's perceptions of those retailers on those attributes. And it allowed us to understand positioning of the retailers relative to each other, as well as which attributes those retailers were perceived as having or not having based on their locations. After that, we overlaid that map with a preference map, where the preference map showed us where each of the consumers who took our survey, where their preferences are. And perhaps it then lets us understand where people value different attributes. So I'll jump ahead and I'll show you the end product of the chapter example. If you want to walk back through the Chapter 5 example, I encourage you to look at the Chapter 5 perceptual and preference map example. At the end of that example, we ended up with a map in Tableau that looks something like this. Now, in this map, we can see this is both the perceptual and the preference map. The orange dots represented the different retailer locations. And these blue dots at the end of the example represented each respondent's preference location. So you can see here when I highlight over this respondent, this is respondent 7 from our data, and this respondent seems to value product variety and in-store experience, maybe a little bit of convenience, but not so much location, price, customer service, and product quality. So what we might want to ask ourselves, beyond just looking at this map and getting a sense of where the retailers show up and where the preference shows up, is we might want to ask ourselves that, can we predict or estimate what we think are the market shares, or essentially which of these respondents is likely to buy from which of these retailers? And there's multiple ways that you can actually measure the market shares. So I'm going to show you how to measure market shares in two ways, two of the more common ways. One that we're going to call the first choice rule, and the other we're going to measure is called the logit share of preference rule. And each of these might be usable or best used in different situations. So the first choice rule, what it is going to try and do is it's going to look at the position of each of these blue dots, and it's going to measure the distance between these blue dots and each of the retailers. And it's going to assume that whichever retailer you're closest to, that you would always buy from that retailer. So let's take a straightforward one. This respondent 42 down here is closest to retailer D. So in a first choice rule model, it would say that respondent 42 gives 100% of his or her market share to retailer D. The logit share of preference rule is a little different in the sense that it will still assume that your preference goes mostly to the retailer that you're closest to, but in the ratio of the logit share is going to give your share to other retailers based on how far away you are. So if we look at another person, let's say respondent 32 here next to retailer F, the logit share of preference would say respondent 32 is most likely to still buy from retailer F because this person is closest to retailer F. But perhaps the second most likely might be something like retailer D or retailer A, because it's going to measure the distance between the blue dot and all of the retailers, and it's going to give a proportion of the share based on the logit rule to each of the retailers. So what we can do is we can measure the market share using those two rules and see how similar or different it is, and think about what situations we might want to use the first choice rule versus the logit share of preference rule. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back over into R, where we had in chapter 5 originally run the code to measure the locations of each of the respondents and the brands and the attributes. We'll go ahead and run that code again in R just so we have the right data of all these points. And then what I've added to the code at the bottom is I've added code that measures the first choice rule and tells you the market share for each of the retailers based on this map, and measures the logit share of preference rule. So let's go back over into R. So over here in R, what we're going to do is we're going to start by opening. In this case, we have a new file, not just called perceptual and preference maps, but also with market share. It'll look very similar to the R code from chapter 5. In fact, up until this point here where it says calculate market shares, this code should be exactly the same as the code from the chapter 5 example. So if we haven't done so already, we start by loading up the packages. So in this case, we do need a package, the data.table package. So we're going to start by loading that up. I'm just going to pick the cloud. And that should put in the package. Now we have to load the library of that package. And we'll go ahead and set our seed. The next step, we had to load in the two files, the perceptions files, which is the retailers by attributes and the average scores of each of those retailers on each attribute. So in this case, that's the perceptions file. We're going to load the preference file. Then we'll go ahead and run the analysis the same as we would have for the example. Now it's going to go ahead and write out these different tables with the perception attributes, perception scores, and preference scores. And we're going to need that information if we were to build that map. Now down below, for the preferences, we actually do not need to know the locations on the map can be generated by looking just at the preference. So we can run this if we want. This will allow us to do the Tableau map to look at. So in this case, we have the first one is the perceptions attributes file. The second one is the perception scores file. And the third one is the preference scores file. Now, what we could do in the chapter 5 example is we would go to Tableau and we could generate that map that we were just looking at, where we had the brands, the attributes, and the respondents. Now, what we have here at the bottom is in this code, we can actually measure the market shares. So first choice, if you remember what I said, first choice is all about looking at the distance between you and the different location. So if we want to measure first choice based on your preference ratings that you gave, the way we would do that is we would first measure the distance between all the preferences, and then we're going to go ahead and print out the result by looking at the market share for all the respondents. So if we run the first choice market share, we see here that based on first choice, meaning you as a respondent will always purchase from the place you want to purchase most, we can see here that retailer D, retailer B, and Chestnut Ridge seem to all have the highest shares. A, C, and F and have pretty low shares, and E is also relatively low at about 10%. Right? The second part is we can do what's called the logit share preference. The logit share preference model looks at the distance between all of them and uses the logit rule. In this case, it takes the exponential of the preference distance location, so essentially how close you are to the best option, and divides by the sum of all of the distances of the exponential of all of the distances to figure out how much you might give each share to each one. And then we're going to take the average of those across individuals, the respondents, to get the result. So when we run that, we can see here that we get somewhat similar results. So Chestnut Ridge goes from being about almost 22% using the first choice rule to about 19% using the logit share of preference rule. But in general, you can see quite a bit of similarity between the two options. The more differences you see, the more you would have cases in which an individual is sort of in the middle and might be only marginally closer to one, but not so different in terms of closeness to another. But first choice rule would give all of that person's choice to whichever is closest, whereas share of preference, the logit share of preference rule, would actually give closer to 50-50% with just a little bit more going to the one that's closer to the best option. When should we use the first choice and the logit share of preference rules? Well, as you can see, based on how people choose, think about situations in which you only buy the thing you want the most, and think about situations in which you buy maybe the thing you want the most of the time, but also might variety seek and buy some other things. So the tendency is when we have situations where you might have a very high involvement, high value purchase. Suppose you're going to go out and buy a new cell phone or let's say a car or a house, something that's a very big purchase. You're probably going to buy one and you're going to buy the one you want the most. So in that case, when you're looking at people's preferences of buying high involvement, high value, low frequency purchase items, maybe first choice rule is going to give you the most accurate representation of market share. In cases in which people might buy the thing they like the most often, but other things as well. So think maybe you're a member of a loyalty program, say for an airline. You might fly the airline that you value the most, whether it's due to you being closest to a hub of that airline, or you're in the loyalty program of that airline, something that makes it stickier for you to want to buy from one airline. But there might be cases in which maybe that airline doesn't have a good flight and you need to take something else sometime to get somewhere else. So in that case, you might still fly with the airline that you are most loyal to most often, but you might once in a while fly somewhere else with some other provider in cases in which there is something better about that option, convenience, price, whatever the attribute is. In those cases, logit share of preference makes a lot of sense because it'll say, I'll still give most of the share to the one you want the most, but I'll give a little bit to the others depending on situations where you might value certain other attributes a little bit for that other option. And as you get to more and more variety seeking types of situations, let's say fast moving consumer packaged goods, logit share of preference makes even more sense when people are making different choices all of the time and perhaps purposefully variety seeking or being sensitive to things like price promotions. So that's an example of how we can add to the Chapter 5 example, not necessarily by changing how we do the perceptual and preference map, but perhaps ways that we can further analyze the map and not just say, this retailer is close to this preference, but we can actually measure how close they are to a certain amount of preference. And what you can also do is you could say, I'm going to put a retailer on a certain point of the map, and then I can actually measure the distance and see where, if I move that retailer to a new location, how might that change the preference people have who responded to the survey. So if you want the code for this example, you can look at the links below, and there'll be a link to download if you want this code and the data to run this example, and also the Tableau packaged workbook to look at the example of Chapter 5 at the end when we saw the finished joint map, the perceptual and preference map. In addition, there are many other chapter examples and extensions to look at. So feel free to check some other out and get the code and the data and the examples for those others.